Hello and welcome to Spotlights. This is the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. I'm your host, Sam Mickey, and for this week, it's a privilege and a pleasure to welcome onto the show Carl Anthony. Carl, welcome.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Well, I really appreciate you making the time for us. For people who don't know you already, a little bit of a background. You're an American architect, regional planner, social justice activist, and an author. You're the co-director, founder with Paloma Pavel of Breakthrough Communities, which is a project dedicated to building multiracial leadership for sustainable communities in California and across the nation. What else? You're also the former president of the Earth Island Institute, co-founder, former executive director of its urban habitat program, which, according to my understanding, was one of the first environmental justice organizations to address race and class issues. Uh,
It,
so you're also, the author of a book, "The Earth, the City, and the Hidden Narrative of Race." I want to chat about that a little today. And also, very timely, you're the recipient of this year's award for the Thomas Berry Award. I think that began in the late '90s with the Center for Respect of Life and Environment and the Humane Society started this award with the Thomas Berry Foundation. And so you're carrying forward Thomas's work in a really innovative and interesting way. So, thank you so much for being here. First and foremost, I want to hear just a little bit about your work in general, and I guess specifically with Breakthrough Communities. What have you been up to lately? What is Breakthrough Communities?
well, we, I guess I was in a position of working for the Ford Foundation, and Dr. Pavel was director of our strategic communications agenda for the work that I was doing at Ford. And we had an opportunity to elaborate on the grants that I was giving, uh, mostly for environmental grants for communities of color who were primarily doing other things to advance the issues of communities of color. And I saw an opportunity, and Dr. Pavel also saw the opportunity to bring the focus, bring a sharper focus on the issues of sustainability in that work at the Ford Foundation.
Nice. Yeah, really special, really great work. And I know a lot of people in the Bay Area definitely know that it's a very flagship institution around here. Um, so also, I want to hear a little bit more. I know that some stories about breakthrough communities are in your book, but I also want to hear a little bit more about it, especially for any of our listeners or viewers who don't know it. It's a really wonderful book, "The Earth, the City, and the Hidden Narrative of Race." So could you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, yes, actually, that book is in part an autobiographical, and my intention was to lift up a set of experiences that are not that uh, well developed within the environmental community that positions our community at the African American community to go back to the origin of humanity. You know, on 250,000 years ago in the Rift Valley, the Africans uh, came down from the trees and uh, began to walk across the savannah. And that part of that heritage, which was many thousands of years before we got enslaved by the Europeans who were coming to Africa to get labor force, we had been developing a culture. African, our ancestors were developing a culture that has a lot to do with our thinking about our climate change issues today, because the emergent issues of climate is what was responsible, in part, at least, and some by some people, maybe even more than a part, for the emergence of the human race.
I really appreciate that perspective. It's so, different than the normal narrative you hear when people are talking about like environmentalism. They go back to like Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson and John Muir, and it's this very as if it's this very recent phenomenon. And you're saying, well, actually, the history, right, of the human relationship to nature, we need to think about the entire evolutionary trajectory of the species. So you're really thinking about the human at the whole species level.
I think that's correct. And I also think that our history, speaking as African Americans, our history gives us a window on looking at all of humanity's relationship to the environment, and our recent history, which is 400 or 500 years old, uh, really emerged at a point when the Europeans were uh, really gaining a mastery of the oceans and were able to translate that to their own personal advantage, but really ignoring the profound experience of many non-European cultures, and the Africans were a part of that. So it's really adding a dimension to all of human history.
Yes, yes, exactly. And you know, sometimes I think when people get into this larger evolutionary or ecological perspective, you know, thinking about the whole Earth, even, then they miss urban issues, specifically the city. You know, a lot of ecologically minded people are always just trying to get away from the city and they want to be in the wild. And so, one of the really special things about your work is the way you focus on cities so much while also focusing on this larger evolutionary narrative. So, for you, what's the role of the city in human evolution or in our current historical moment?
Well, you know, the primary relationship between people and the cities uh, grew up at the time that people began to develop an approach to agriculture, and the cities were an important uh, contribution to those efforts. And I would say maybe 20,000 years ago or 15,000 years ago, when many of the ancient civilizations began to emerge, uh, there was a great deal of work that was underway within the African American community on the African community on those important uh, changes that were happening uh, in the human relationship to the environment, and the city was an important part of that.
And so then for the future of humanity, to have a sustainable relationship and a just relationship to the earth, we can still have cities, but obviously the way we're currently planning them and organizing them isn't really getting it done.
Yeah, that's right. And so our historical experience is also a critique of the sort of dominant view of the cities, which is not so much related to nature as it is related to accumulation of capital and the creation of human power in the larger universe, uh, ignoring the ecological foundation of that in in our exploitation of the resources of nature.
This kind of, you know, ecological and evolutionary perspective obviously is very close to the work of Thomas Berry, who's so influential for the forum on religion and ecology, and for really a lot of people in different fields of study and different kinds of activists and advocates. So, like I mentioned, you with Paloma Pavel are the recipients this year of the Thomas Berry Award, and so congratulations. That's very special, and also a really good indication that Thomas Berry's thought has all these different kind of applications and implications. And so I wonder if you want to say a little bit about how Thomas Berry's thinking came into your life and what role it plays.
Well, well, it's important to realize that my understanding of the universe was actually shaped by my elementary school education, and this was long before I learned anything about Thomas Berry. And this period of human evolution, which really began with the history of the Earth, which was gaining much more consciousness in the human community. At the same time, the African peoples were becoming a contributor to that, to the our common heritage in relationship to the city. And we I would say that our ancestors really explored so many of the foundations of our work in agriculture at the same time that we became aware of the villages and the cities. And much of that has been going on in Africa, in the communities that are uh, very much uh, related to our dependence on the natural world during that period.
Right, right, exactly. I really appreciate knowing that your early childhood education provided you with this because hear that a lot from people who are hearing about some of these kind of evolutionary ideas and thinking about large historical patterns, and they say, "Well, I didn't learn this in school. We need to get this out to the schools." So it sounds like you were in a context
Well,
where that was communicated really
it
well.
was communicated, and I was in the class to my brother. My brother was who actually grew up to become an astrophysicist,
Hmm.
and so we used to have debates far into the night about uh, astrophysics, which I didn't really understand much of, but nevertheless, for young people, we could maintain a debate without knowing much about what you're talking about. But the most important thing is that for me, the whole consciousness uh, of the human evolution in Africa, which was off limits to most European people, but the whole idea of the universe story gave me a really entry point, which goes back to my own experience as a child and growing up as with a brother who was an astrophysicist, and it gave me an opportunity of reclaiming that perspective to contemporary issues.
I really appreciate the way that kids can have debates about things, even if you don't know much about it. I think that's a lot of good conversations and
That,
dialogues can come
and
out of that.
we might actually know the most essential things about it, but it was part of my experience that because I was in an American situation in which our experience of the natural world was really cut off from us because of this European tradition. And so the rediscovery of the importance of African culture in the development of our understanding of cities is really an important starting point, which is quite different than the points of, as you had mentioned, many of the founders of a modern environmental movement.
Right, exactly. Yeah, they generally ignore that larger history of and evolution of the species, and they're really not thinking about the important role that cities play.
Yes,
Um,
and you know, one of the important aspects of this is that in discarding the experience of Africans, we really lose much of the experience of uh, development of our understanding of our relationship to the natural world. You know, we as the whole idea, particularly with new ecological thinking, which shows that we have to relate to the larger than human world in order to really understand our place. Um, this emphasis on the larger than uh, human world was not something that anyone in the culture that I grew up with uh, had really much expertise in, except for these strange people who were called themselves environmentalists.
you have strange people indeed. That's true, and now, thanks to your work largely, there's a lot more people who are getting exposed to this and have this sense that you can connect to the more than human world, even if you're in a city, precisely by this deeper understanding of your evolution and understanding your cosmic context.
Yeah, and I think one of the really important parts of this is that where we were kind of presented with the view that if we're going to really deal with modern science, And anything that was being presented to us, we had to sort of cut ourselves off from our evolutionary context. And what Thomas Berry's work did for me, and I think for a lot of other people, is showing a connection between the diversity of human experience in relating to the natural world, and uh, access this information that came out of our own history was another path toward understanding our reliance on uh, traditional cultures as a way of understanding ourselves. And it's very interesting that some people these days, relate very much to the indigenous experience, because this is a way of kind of getting back to that matrix that have given rise to all humanities. But they very often don't think about the hundreds of thousands of years of African experience as really part of our indigenous wisdom that needs to be recovered.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I definitely noticed that. And it makes sense that, in North America, when we're talking about indigenous cultures, that we might focus a lot on North American indigenous cultures, but forgetting the larger global context and the evolutionary context means we just forget about the entire continent of Africa.
Exactly. And a great deal of other parts of the world, which were thousands of years depended upon our being able to relate to the natural world as a prerequisite for our own survival. And this notion that somehow we have to relate to the natural world, and it means that we should be cut off from our own cultures, is something that's we're challenging now to see that our own traditions of relating to the natural world are really an important contribution to understanding uh, much of the modern condition, but both in its positive aspects, but also in its negative aspects on the human community as well as the natural world.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And that's such a big part of the whole mission of the Forum on Religion and Ecology. It's precisely that we can't uh, shake these traditions. We can't get rid of them even if we wanted to. And so we need to examine the problems and the promise, the dignity and the disaster, and find a way to reconstruct these traditions in a just and livable way.
Exactly. And as
Uh,
it turns out, that these traditions, these indigenous traditions, give us a foundation that has been, except for the last century. Before that, many cultures had access to traditional understandings of the natural world. Even in the 19th century, the number of people who, for example, used almanacs as a way of understanding their position in the universe. And that's sort of been lost in the last 150 years.
that's a good example. Yeah. That's interesting. I don't know anybody that uses almanacs anymore. Yeah, that's a lost art.
Exactly.
Well, what would be, in light of these kind of things that we've lost, right? People are trying to reconnect. They're looking for some way to reintegrate, and I always like to kind of ask people on the podcast, what would be one thing that somebody could start with if maybe this is really new to them and they want to start on this path of reintegrating into their tradition, Earth evolution. What would be one thing you might recommend, whether that's maybe a reading, a book, or a practice or a
I would,
meditation?
people talk a very great deal about Rachel Carson, and for good reasons, because she pointed a way toward the natural world that many people kind of sat up and took notice. But I also want to mention um, Carver, who was an agronomist from the African American community, who gained fame for sort of celebrating the peanut as a critical element. But actually, beneath that was an understanding of the soil and how it had been degraded by the harvesting of so much cotton. and how the growing of peanuts really restored many of the features of the soil that were kind of necessary in order to really undo the damage of all that uh, production of cotton uh, that was really degrading the soil at that time.
Nice. That's such a good example. Yeah, George Washington Carver. That's how, I grew up just hearing him like, oh, yeah, the peanut guy. And then later you find out, like, no, this was restorative agriculture that can heal our soils, which is exactly what kind of wisdom we need right now.
Exactly.
Yeah, perfect. Geez, that's a perfect note to end on. Carl Anthony, thank you so much for sharing your time with us. And congratulations again on receiving the Thomas Berry Award. So I guess, I got to let you go. But for folks who are tuning in, next week we'll be back with Paloma Pavel, and she'll get to share more about her perspective on some of this work and with breakthrough communities. So in the meantime, take care and
Thank
be
you very
well.
much. It's been a pleasure to be part of this series, and I'll be looking forward to tuning into that as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Carl.